The sound of a shovel striking hard earth echoed through the dawn as Miles Tucker dug into the rich soil beneath the sprawling oak tree on the edge of his property. His hands blistered and bled, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache in his chest. Sarah was gone, and no amount of digging would bring her back. It was 1885 in Challis, Idaho, a small town nestled in the shadow of the Salmon River Mountains. The settlement had sprung up during the mining boom a decade earlier, but now survived primarily on cattle ranching and the occasional prospector passing through. Miles had come here with Sarah 5 years ago, full of dreams about building a cattle empire in the West. Now he stood alone, carving a final resting place for the woman who had given his life purpose. The oak tree had been Sarah's favorite spot on their modest ranch. She'd often sit beneath its branches with her sewing or a book, enjoying the rare moments of peace between her endless chores. "When my time comes," she'd once told him, "bury me under this oak so I can watch over you and the land forever." He'd laughed it off then, telling her not to speak of such things, that they had decades ahead of them, but the fever had other plans. 3 days it took. 3 days of watching helplessly as the woman he loved burned with fever, her breathing growing more labored by the hour. Dr. Simmons had done what he could, which wasn't much. "I'm sorry, Miles," he'd said, gathering his useless medicines. "These mountain fevers can be merciless." She died in the night, clutching his hand, her last words a whispered, "I love you." Miles wiped sweat from his brow and continued digging. The hole was nearly deep enough now. He'd made the pine coffin himself, working through the night by lamplight, his tears falling on the wood as he hammered. "Mr. Tucker?" The voice startled him. He turned to see Bridget Zimmer standing a respectful distance away, clutching a bundle of wildflowers in her hands. She lived on the neighboring property with her father, a German immigrant who'd come west to try his hand at ranching after his wife passed. Miles had spoken to her only a handful of times in town or at church socials. She was a pretty young woman, perhaps 25, with honey-colored hair and kind eyes, but Miles had never paid her much mind, having eyes only for Sarah. "Miss Zimmer," he acknowledged with a nod, setting his shovel aside. "I heard about Sarah," she said, her voice gentle. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Miles swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. "Thank you." "I brought these," she said, stepping forward to show him the flowers. "They're not much, but they're the first blooms of spring. Sarah once mentioned how much she loved wildflowers." Miles was surprised. He hadn't known the women were acquainted beyond polite greetings at church. "That's kind of you," he managed, accepting the flowers. The brilliant purples and yellows seemed obscene against the darkness of the grave. "Would it be all right if I stayed?" "For the burial," Bridget asked hesitantly. "No one should have to say goodbye alone." Miles wanted to refuse. This moment felt too private, too raw for witnesses. But something in Bridget's eyes, not pity but a genuine sadness, made him nod. "I'd appreciate that," he said, the words surprising him as they left his mouth. The burial was simple. Miles placed Sarah's body, wrapped in her favorite quilt, into the pine coffin. He added a lock of her auburn hair he'd cut to keep, then changed his mind and tucked it back with her. Better to keep nothing, to make the break clean. Bridget stood silently as he nailed the lid shut, each strike of the hammer a thunderclap in the quiet morning. Together they lowered the coffin into the grave. Miles recited the Lord's Prayer, his voice breaking several times. When he finished, Bridget scattered her wildflowers over the coffin, then helped him fill in the grave. "I'll bring a proper marker from town," Miles said, patting down the last of the dirt. "I could help you make one," Bridget offered. "My father taught me to carve wood." Miles looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Her hands were calloused like his own, her face tanned from working outdoors. She wasn't a delicate town woman but a rancher's daughter who knew the hardships of frontier life. "I'd be obliged," he said finally. That evening, Miles sat alone in the cabin he'd built for Sarah, the silence oppressive. The house still smelled like her, the lavender sachets she tucked into the dresser drawers, the lingering scent of the bread she'd baked just before falling ill. He couldn't bring himself to clear away her things. The half-finished quilt on the rocking chair, her hairbrush on the dresser with strands of auburn hair still caught in the bristles. He pulled out a bottle of whiskey and drank straight from it, willing himself into oblivion. But sleep, when it finally came, brought no relief, only dreams of Sarah calling his name, her voice fading as he desperately tried to reach her. The first week passed in a blur of grief and whiskey. Miles did the bare minimum to keep the ranch running, feeding the livestock mechanically, moving like a man underwater. He avoided the oak tree, unable to face the fresh mound of earth that had stolen his future. On Sunday morning, exactly 1 week after the burial, Miles woke from another restless night to the sound of hoofbeats approaching. He grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, squinting in the bright morning light. It was Bridget Zimmer, riding a sturdy brown mare. She carried something wrapped in cloth. "Morning, Mr. Tucker," she called, dismounting with ease. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Miles lowered his rifle, suddenly aware of his disheveled appearance. He hadn't shaved in days, and he was still wearing the same clothes from yesterday. "Miss Zimmer," he greeted, his voice rough from disuse. "What brings you here?" She approached the porch, unwrapping the bundle she carried to reveal a wooden cross, beautifully carved with Sarah's name and dates of birth and death. Around the edges, Bridget had meticulously carved small wildflowers. "I thought you might want to place this today," she said, "and I brought fresh flowers for her." Miles stared at the marker, running his fingers over the careful carving. "This must have taken you days." "It kept my hands busy in the evenings," she said with a small smile. He noticed then that she wore her Sunday dress, though it was clear she had no intention of going to church. She'd come straight here instead. "Would you like to place it together?" she asked. Miles hesitated, then nodded. "Let me get cleaned up first. Would you care for some coffee?" "That would be nice, thank you." Inside, Miles hastily washed his face and changed his shirt, suddenly embarrassed by the state of the cabin. Dishes were piled in the washbasin, clothes strewn about. He quickly tidied what he could before putting the coffee on to boil. When he returned to the porch, Bridget was sitting in Sarah's rocking chair, her eyes on the distant mountains. She stood when she saw him. "I took the liberty of picking a few more flowers from your meadow," she said, indicating a fresh bouquet she'd gathered. "The blue ones were starting to bloom." Sarah loved those, Miles said, his throat tight. They always reminded her of the ocean. She grew up on the coast in Oregon. "I didn't know that," Bridget said. "Did she miss it terribly?" "Sometimes. But she loved it here too," said the mountains had their own kind of magic. They drank their coffee in companionable silence, then rode together to the oak tree. The grave looked starker in the bright sunlight than it had a week ago, the earth already starting to settle. Miles hammered the cross into place at the head of the grave while Bridget arranged her flowers. When he finished, they stood side by side, looking down at the final resting place of Sarah Tucker. "Would you like a moment alone?" Bridget asked gently. Miles shook his head. "No, but thank you for this," he said, gesturing to the marker. "It's finer than anything I could have made." It was the least I could do. Sarah was always kind to me when we'd meet in town. She gave me her recipe for sourdough bread once when mine kept failing. Miles smiled faintly. She was generous that way. As they rode back to the cabin, Miles felt a subtle shift within himself. The grief was still there, a constant companion, but Bridget's kindness had eased its crushing weight, if only momentarily. "Same time next week?" Bridget asked as she prepared to leave. "I thought I might bring fresh flowers regularly. The grave shouldn't be without them." Miles was touched by the offer. "That's mighty thoughtful, but I wouldn't want to impose on your time." "It's no imposition," she assured him. "My father and I don't keep cattle like you do, just a few horses and our vegetable garden. Sunday mornings are quiet for us." Miles nodded, grateful beyond words. "Then yes, I'd appreciate that." True to her word, Bridget came the following Sunday and the Sunday after that. Each week, she brought fresh wildflowers and a bit of news from town or a baked good sourdough bread made from Sarah's recipe, or apple turnovers that Miles hadn't tasted since Sarah's passing. At first, Miles would meet her at the oak tree, help place the flowers, then bid her good day. But as spring warmed into summer, their ritual evolved. Bridget would arrive, they would visit Sarah's grave together, and then return to the cabin for coffee or lemonade. Sometimes they would talk. Other times, they would sit in comfortable silence on the porch, watching the clouds drift over the mountains. Miles found himself looking forward to these Sunday visits. Bridget never pushed him to talk about Sarah, but when he did, she listened attentively. She shared stories of her own losses: her mother when she was 12, a brother who died in a mining accident back in Pennsylvania before they came west. "Grief is a peculiar thing," she said one hot August afternoon as they sat in the shade of the porch. "It changes shape, but never truly leaves." Miles nodded, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. "I still talk to her sometimes, when I'm out with the cattle or just before sleep." "Is that strange?" "Not at all," Bridget said, her eyes kind. "Who better to share your thoughts with than someone who knew your heart so well?" Something eased in Miles's chest at her words. He'd feared he was losing his mind, carrying on one-sided conversations with Sarah. But Bridget made it sound natural, even necessary. As summer faded into fall, Miles realized he was shaving before Bridget's visits, making sure the cabin was tidy, even picking wildflowers himself to have ready when she arrived. He caught himself watching the road on Sunday mornings, listening for the familiar rhythm of her mare's hooves. One Sunday in late September, Bridget arrived looking troubled. Miles could tell something was wrong as soon as she dismounted. "What is it?" he asked, taking the reins of her horse. "It's my father," she said, her voice tight with worry. "He fell yesterday while repairing the barn roof. His leg is broken badly. Dr. Simmons says he needs to stay off it for at least 8 weeks. "I'm sorry to hear that," Miles said, genuinely concerned. Edmund Zimmer was well into his 60s, and a broken leg at his age was serious. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Bridget bit her lip. "Actually, that's why I'm here. We have the horses to tend to and the gardens ready for harvest, not to mention the repairs to the barn that still need finishing before winter. I can manage some of it, but—" She trailed off, looking embarrassed. "Say no more," Miles said firmly. "I'll come by tomorrow morning and help with whatever needs doing." Relief flooded her face. "I can't ask you to neglect your own ranch." "You're not asking, I'm offering. Besides, my place is running smooth enough that I can spare a few hours each day. We neighbors need to look out for each other out here." The gratitude in her eyes made something stir in Miles's chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The next day, Miles rode over to the Zimmer place at dawn. It was a modest homestead. A sturdy log cabin, a small barn, a corral with 4 horses, and a large vegetable garden. Edmund Zimmer sat propped up in a chair on the porch, his splinted leg extended before him, looking frustrated at his own helplessness. "Tucker," he greeted gruffly. "Appreciate you coming." "Happy to help, Mr. Zimmer," Miles replied, tipping his hat. "Just point me to what needs doing most." For the next several weeks, Miles split his time between his own ranch and the Zimmers. He repaired the barn roof, helped Bridget harvest the garden, and tended to the horses. Sometimes he would work alongside Bridget, finding a natural rhythm with her that reminded him of his early days with Sarah. Other times, he would sit with Edmund, listening to stories of Germany and the old man's early years in America. He learned more about Bridget during these visits than he had in all their Sunday meetings. She had a quick wit that emerged when she was comfortable, a lovely singing voice that he caught snatches of when she thought no one was listening, and a fierce determination that reminded him of Sarah, though the two women were otherwise quite different. Where Sarah had been fiery and impulsive, Bridget was steady and thoughtful. Where Sarah had struggled with the isolation of ranch life, Bridget seemed to thrive in the quiet rhythms of the wilderness. Both women, however, possessed a kindness and strength that Miles deeply admired. One evening in late October, Miles stayed for supper at Edmund's insistence. The old man had noticed something developing between his daughter and the neighboring rancher, something neither of them seemed fully aware of yet. "You're too thin, Tucker," Edmund declared. "My Bridget makes a stew that'll put meat on your bones." The meal was indeed delicious, reminding Miles that he'd been living primarily on coffee and whatever simple food he could throw together between chores. As they ate by lamplight, the cabin warm against the autumn chill outside, Miles found himself laughing at one of Edmund's stories, really laughing for the first time since Sarah's death. The sound startled him into silence. Guilt crashed over him immediately. How could he sit here laughing when Sarah was in the cold ground? Bridget noticed the change in his demeanor. After dinner, as Miles prepared to leave, she followed him out to where his horse was tethered. "What happened in there?" she asked directly. "One minute you were laughing, the next you looked like you'd seen a ghost." Miles busied himself checking his saddle straps. "It's nothing. It's not nothing," she persisted. "You looked stricken." Miles sighed, his breath visible in the cold night air. It felt wrong to be laughing, enjoying myself when Sarah can't." Bridget was quiet for a moment. "Do you think Sarah would want you to never laugh again?" The question hung between them, unanswerable. Finally, Miles shook his head. "No, she wouldn't. She always said life was too short not to find joy where you could." He met Bridget's eyes in the dim light spilling from the cabin windows. "Still feels like betrayal, though." "Moving forward isn't betrayal, Miles," she said softly, using his first name for the first time. "It's survival." He mounted his horse, troubled by her words and by the way his heart had quickened when she said his name. "I'll be by tomorrow to finish the North Corral fence," he said, tipping his hat. "Miles," she called as he turned his horse toward home. "Sarah would want you to be happy, I'm certain of it." He rode home through the moonlit forest, her words echoing in his mind. Would Sarah want him to be happy? Of course she would. But could he be happy without her? That was the question that haunted him. The next morning brought the first snow of the season, light flurries that dusted the landscape in white. Miles spent the morning tending to his own ranch, then rode to the Zimmers after lunch. The snow had stopped, but the air remained bitingly cold. He found Bridget in the barn, adding fresh straw to the horse stalls. She looked up when he entered, her cheeks pink from exertion and cold. "You didn't have to come today," she said. "The weather's turning." "Said I'd finish that fence," Miles replied, stamping his boots to warm his feet. "Besides, winter's coming whether we like it or not. Best to be prepared." They worked side by side in the corral, Miles securing fence posts while Bridget handed him tools and held boards in place. The physical labor kept them warm despite the chill, and their conversation flowed easily. Miles found himself sharing stories about his childhood in Missouri, his journey west after the war, meeting Sarah in a small town in Oregon where she'd been teaching school. "You must have charmed her right away," Bridget said, smiling. Miles chuckled. "Hardly. She thought I was a rough, uneducated cowhand with more muscle than sense. Took months of courtship before she agreed to marry me. Even then, I think she had her doubts about following me to Idaho territory." "But she did," Bridget said softly. "She did," Miles agreed, his voice turning wistful. "Said she'd rather regret something she did than something she was too afraid to try." They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the thud of the hammer and the occasional nickering of horses from the barn. "What about you?" Miles asked eventually. "No suitors lined up in town." Bridget laughed, the sound bright in the cold air. "Not many eligible bachelors in Challies interested in a woman who can outride most men and prefers pants to dresses when working." "Their loss," Miles said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. Bridget glanced at him, a question in her eyes that Miles wasn't ready to answer. They finished the fence as the early winter dusk settled over the mountains. Miles packed up his tools while Bridget checked on her father inside. When she returned, she carried a small package wrapped in cloth. "For you," she said, handing it to him. "Some of that stew from last night. I thought you might appreciate a hot meal when you get home." The simple gesture touched Miles deeply. "Thank you," he said, tucking the package into his saddlebag. As he mounted his horse, Bridget reached up to adjust his scarf, tucking it more securely against the cold. The brief touch of her fingers against his neck sent a jolt through Miles that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Be careful riding home," she said. "The trail gets treacherous in the snow." "I will," he promised, suddenly reluctant to leave. That night, as Miles ate Bridget's stew by his fireside, he found himself thinking not of Sarah as had been his custom every evening, but of Bridget's smile, the determined set of her jaw as she worked, the grace with which she moved. The realization brought both pleasure and pleasure at the warmth these thoughts kindled, pain at what felt like another step away from Sarah. Sunday dawned clear and cold. Miles woke early, shaved carefully, and put on his best shirt. He gathered a bundle of pine boughs with bright red berries, the only splash of color in the winter landscape, then rode to meet Bridget at the oak tree. She was already there when he arrived, kneeling by Sarah's grave, brushing snow from the wooden marker. She wore a blue woolen dress with her practical coat, her honey-colored hair partially visible beneath her bonnet. "Good morning," Miles called, dismounting. Bridget turned, her face lighting up at the sight of him. "Good morning. I wasn't sure if you'd come with the snow and all." "Wouldn't miss it," Miles said, approaching with his pine boughs. Together they arranged the greenery on the grave, the red berries vivid against the white snow. "It's beautiful," Bridget said, stepping back to admire their handiwork. "Sarah would approve, I think." Miles nodded, his throat suddenly tight. "Bridget," he began, then faltered. She looked at him expectantly, her breath creating small clouds in the cold air. "I've been meaning to thank you," he continued, "for all of this, coming here every week, helping me remember her properly. Most folks would have let me grieve alone. I didn't do it out of obligation," she said quietly. "I did it because I wanted to." The honesty in her voice gave Miles courage. "I've come to look forward to our Sundays and our time at your place these past weeks." He took a deep breath. "I never expected to feel this way again." Bridget's eyes widened slightly, and Miles feared he'd spoken too boldly, but then her expression softened. "Neither did I," she admitted. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken feelings between them. "It's still Sarah's day," Miles said finally, gesturing to the grave. "But perhaps, if you're willing, you might join me for supper this Friday, at my place." The smile that spread across Bridget's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I'd like that very much," she said. Friday arrived with another snowfall, heavier this time, blanketing the land in white. Miles spent the morning tending to his cattle, making sure they had access to feed and unfrozen water. In the afternoon, he turned his attention to the cabin, cleaning it more thoroughly than he had in months. He put away some of Sarah's things that still lay about her sewing basket, her hairbrush, the half-finished quilt. Not everything, he couldn't bear that yet, but enough to make space both physically and emotionally for what might be beginning with Bridget. As the afternoon waned, Miles prepared the simple meal he'd planned. Venison stew, cornbread, and apple pie purchased from Mrs. Johnson in town. It wasn't fancy, but it was the best he could manage. He set the table with care, using the good dishes that had been a wedding gift from Sarah's parents. When Bridget arrived, snowflakes clinging to her coat and hat, Miles felt a surge of nervous anticipation unlike anything he'd experienced since courting Sarah. "You made it," he said, taking her coat. "I was worried the snow might keep you home." "It would take more than a little snow to keep me away," she replied, her cheeks flushed from cold and perhaps something more. The evening passed in easy conversation. They spoke of their childhoods, their dreams, books they had read, places they hoped to see. Miles found himself laughing again, the guilt less sharp this time, tempered by the knowledge that joy, too, honored Sarah's memory. After dinner, they sat before the fire, cups of coffee warming their hands. Outside, the snow continued to fall, creating a cocoon of quiet around the cabin. "I should head back before it gets too deep," Bridget said reluctantly, setting down her cup. "Stay," Miles said impulsively, then quickly clarified. I mean, it's not safe to ride in this weather after dark. You could take the bed, I'll sleep out here by the fire. Bridget hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and practicality. My father will worry. He knows you're with me, Miles pointed out, and he knows I'm a man of honor. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing shadows across the room. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the windows. All right, Bridget decided. It would be foolish to risk the ride in this weather. Miles felt both relief and a new tension. Having Bridget in his home overnight, even in the most innocent circumstances, felt like a significant step. He made up the bed with fresh linens, then prepared a pallet for himself near the fireplace. They bid each other an awkward goodnight, both acutely aware of the unusual situation. Miles lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind and the occasional creak of the bed as Bridget shifted in her sleep. It felt strange having another woman in Sarah's bed, yet not wrong. More like the natural unfolding of life, one chapter closing as another began. In the morning, they shared a simple breakfast of coffee and leftover cornbread. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white. Miles saddled Bridget's horse while she bundled up against the cold. "Thank you for last night," she said as he helped her mount. "For dinner and for insisting I stay. It was the sensible thing, even if not the most proper." "I hope your father won't think ill of me," Miles said, suddenly concerned about Edmund's reaction. Bridget laughed. "My father has been trying to push us together for weeks. He'll probably be disappointed nothing scandalous happened." Miles felt heat rise to his face, but he laughed too. "Well, we wouldn't want to disappoint him, but perhaps we should court properly first." The words hung in the crisp morning air, a declaration of intent that made Bridget's eyes shine. "Perhaps we should," she agreed softly. Miles reached up to take her gloved hand in his. "May I call on you then, officially?" "Yes," she said, her smile bright against the winter landscape. "Yes, you may." The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm. Miles continued to meet Bridget at Sarah's grave every Sunday, but now they also spent Saturday evenings together, sometimes at his ranch, sometimes at hers with Edmund's chaperone. They attended church together in town, enduring the curious glances and whispers of the townsfolk with quiet dignity. Christmas came, bringing with it a temporary thaw in both the weather and Miles's lingering grief. He gifted Bridget a delicate silver brooch he'd ordered from a catalog, having noticed she owned little jewelry. She gave him a hand-knitted scarf and a book of poetry she'd saved up to purchase from the mercantile. As winter deepened, so did their relationship. Miles found himself sharing thoughts and feelings he'd never expressed aloud before, not even to Sarah. Bridget listened without judgment, offering her own perspectives, challenging him when needed, supporting him always. Edmund's leg healed slowly but steadily, and by February he was mobile again, though he still relied on a cane. Miles continued to help at their ranch, finding satisfaction in working alongside Bridget, building something together, even if that something was just a repaired fence or a well-stocked woodpile. On a particularly bitter February night, Miles stayed late at the Zimmer cabin, reluctant to face the ride home in the freezing temperatures. Edmund had already retired, leaving Miles and Bridget alone by the fire. "I've been thinking," Miles said, watching the firelight play across Bridget's features, "about the future." "Oh," she prompted when he didn't continue. "My ranch is twice the size of yours with better water access and grazing land," he said. "But your garden puts mine to shame, and that root cellar your father built keeps vegetables fresh well into winter." Bridget tilted her head, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Are you proposing a farming partnership, Mr. Tucker?" Miles chuckled, reaching for her hand. "In a manner of speaking." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Bridget. I think I have for months now, maybe from that first day you brought flowers for Sarah. I never expected to love again after losing her, but here I am, completely in love with you." Bridget's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "I love you too, Miles. I think I fell in love with your kindness first, the way you honored Sarah's memory, the gentleness beneath your strength. Miles moved from his chair to kneel before her, still holding her hand. I don't have a ring, yet I can order one from Portland if you'd like, but I can't wait any longer to ask. Bridget Zimmer, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Yes, she said without hesitation, tears spilling onto her cheeks. Yes, I will marry you. Miles stood, pulling her up with him, and kissed her for the first time, a tender, questioning kiss that quickly deepened as Bridget responded with unexpected fervor. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. I should speak to your father, Miles said, resting his forehead against hers. He's already given his blessing, Bridget admitted. He asked me weeks ago when you were going to get around to it, as he put it. Miles laughed, the sound free of guilt for the first time. Smart man, your father. They agreed to marry in the spring, when travel would be easier for the few guests they wished to invite. Edmund would move into Miles's ranch with them, occupying the small room off the kitchen that Miles had originally built as a nursery for the children he and Sarah had hoped to have. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Challies. Most townsfolk received it warmly, having watched the relationship develop over months of church attendances and visits to the mercantile. A few whispered that it was too soon after Sarah's death, but such criticisms were usually silenced by those who had witnessed Miles's grief firsthand and understood the healing Bridget had brought to his life. As the snow began to melt in late March, revealing patches of mud and early wildflowers, Miles and Bridget met at Sarah's grave as they did every Sunday. The oak tree was beginning to bud, tiny green promises of another summer to come. I've been meaning to ask, Bridget said as they laid fresh flowers on the grave, if you're comfortable with me tending to Sarah's grave after we're married. I wouldn't want to intrude on your private remembrance. Miles took her hand, deeply moved by her thoughtfulness. I'd like us to tend it together, he said. Sarah will always be part of my past, but you're my future, Bridget. I think Sarah would be pleased to know I found happiness again, especially with someone who honors her memory as you have. Bridget squeezed his hand, tears shimmering in her eyes. Thank you. That means more than I can say. Their wedding day dawned clear and mild, the first truly warm day of the year. They married in the small church in Challies, with Edmund giving Bridget away and Reverend Phillips officiating. The simple ceremony was attended by a few close friends and neighbors, including Dr. Simmons, who had tended to both Sarah in her final illness and Edmund during his recovery. Bridget wore a new dress of pale blue, with Sarah's silver locket pinned to her bodice, a gift from Miles, who thought his first wife would have wanted his second to have it. Miles wore his Sunday best, freshly pressed, his face clean-shaven, his eyes clear and focused entirely on his bride. After the ceremony, they hosted a small celebration at Miles's ranch, now their ranch, with food and music, and even some dancing in the yard. As the evening drew to a close and their guests departed, Miles found himself standing on the porch with his new wife, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Happy? He asked, his arm around her waist. Completely, she answered, leaning into him. And you? More than I thought possible a year ago, he admitted. When I lost Sarah, I thought that was the end of happiness for me. I never imagined I could find love again, especially with someone who understood that loving you doesn't diminish what I felt for her. Bridget turned in his arms to face him. Love isn't finite, Miles. It grows to fill the space we make for it. She kissed him softly. And I plan to fill our lives with as much love as possible. That night, as they lay together as husband and wife for the first time, Miles felt the last of his guilt slip away. Sarah would always occupy a chamber of his heart, but his heart had proven larger than he knew, with room enough for this new love that felt both familiar and entirely different. Spring bloomed into summer, and with it came changes to the ranch. Bridget expanded the garden, adding herbs and flowers alongside the vegetables. She and Edmund built chicken coops, introducing fresh eggs to their breakfast table. Miles, with Bridget's encouragement, purchased additional cattle and began improving the bloodlines of his herd. Every Sunday, without fail, they visited Sarah's grave together. Sometimes they brought Edmund along, and he would tell stories of his late wife, creating a shared understanding of loss and remembrance that bound the three of them together. In late summer, Bridget began to suspect she was with child. By autumn, there was no doubt. Miles received the news with a mixture of joy and trepidation. "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you," he confessed one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. "Nothing will happen," Bridget assured him, covering his hand with hers. "Women have babies every day, Miles. It's the most natural thing in the world. Sarah and I tried for years," he said quietly. "She never conceived. Sometimes I wondered if it was my fault." Bridget turned to face him in the darkness. "It wasn't anyone's fault. These things happen or they don't, for reasons we can't always understand." She guided his hand back to her abdomen. "But this child is happening, our child. A new life we've created together." As Bridget's pregnancy progressed, Miles found himself caught between excitement and fear. He built a cradle from pine boards, carving delicate patterns along the edges. Bridget sewed baby clothes and blankets, her contentment evident in the songs she hummed while working. Edmund took charge of preparing the nursery, insisting on moving to a small cabin he built at the edge of the property to give the growing family more space. "A child needs room to grow," he declared, "and grandparents need just enough distance to spoil a child without interfering too much." Winter arrived, harsh as always in the mountains. Bridget's belly grew round, her movements slower but no less determined. Miles fretted over her doing too much, while she insisted that staying active was best for her and the baby. They still visited Sarah's grave each Sunday, though Miles now insisted they ride in the wagon rather than on horseback. During these visits, Miles sometimes spoke directly to Sarah, introducing her to Bridget's changing body, sharing his hopes and fears about fatherhood. "I think she's listening," he told Bridget one snowy Sunday. "Sometimes I can almost hear her telling me to stop worrying so much." Bridget laughed, her breath visible in the cold air. "She'd be right. You do worry too much." In early February, during a rare mild spell, Bridget went into labor. Miles sent for the midwife, Mrs. Caldwell, who arrived promptly with her bag of supplies and calm demeanor. Edmund paced the porch, occasionally peering through the window before resuming his circuits. Inside, Miles refused to leave Bridget's side, holding her hand through each contraction, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragements. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and as dawn broke over the mountains, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that immediately captured his father's heart. "He's perfect," Miles whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as Mrs. Caldwell placed the swaddled infant in Bridget's arms. "You're both perfect." They named him William Edmund Tucker, William after Miles's father and Edmund after Bridget's. The boy had a shock of dark hair like Miles and his mother's thoughtful eyes. In the weeks that followed, Miles discovered a new kind of love, one he hadn't known existed: the fierce, protective devotion of a father for his child. He would sit for hours watching William sleep, marveling at his tiny fingers and the steady rise and fall of his chest. Bridget recovered quickly, returning to her duties around the ranch with William strapped to her chest in a sling she'd fashioned. Miles often found himself pausing in his work to watch them, his heart so full it sometimes felt it might burst. Spring came again, turning the landscape green and vibrant. On a particularly beautiful Sunday in April, just over 2 years since Sarah's death, the family made their usual visit to the oak tree. William, now 2 months old, was awake and alert, his eyes taking in the dappled sunlight through the oak's new leaves. Miles knelt by the grave, now covered in fresh grass and wildflowers, the wooden marker weathered but still sturdy. He placed the bouquet they'd brought, then gently took William from Bridget. "Sarah," he said softly, "I'd like you to meet our son, William." He held the baby so that if Sarah were somehow able to see, she would have a clear view of his face. He's got his mother's eyes, and his grandfather tells me my stubborn chin. Bridget knelt beside them, her hand on Miles's shoulder. We'll make sure he knows about you, she promised. About your kindness and your courage in coming west, about how much you loved Miles and this land. Miles felt a sense of peace wash over him, more complete than any he'd experienced before. Here, with his son in his arms and his wife at his side, at the grave of the woman who had first taught him to love, he understood that life was a circle of love and loss, joy and sorrow, each experience enriching the next. "Thank you," he said, and both women in his life, the one present and the one remembered, would have known exactly what he meant. They stayed longer than usual that day, spreading a blanket beneath the oak tree and enjoying a small picnic in the warm spring sunshine. William dozed in his mother's arms while Miles leaned against the trunk of the tree, watching a pair of bluebirds dart among the branches. "I was thinking," Bridget said as she gently rocked their son, "that we might plant some rose bushes around the grave this year. Sarah once mentioned to me that she loved roses but could never get them to grow in this soil." "I think she'd like that," Miles agreed. "Maybe we could add a small fence too to protect them from the deer." As they discussed their plans, Miles reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The devastating grief that had nearly broken him, the unexpected friendship that had saved him, the love that had grown slowly and steadily between them. He thought of all the Sundays Bridget had faithfully brought flowers to Sarah's grave, how that simple act of kindness had opened the door to healing. He thought of Edmund, who had welcomed him as a son even before he and Bridget were married. He thought of their child, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the complex tapestry of love and loss that had created the family he was born into. In that moment, under the spreading branches of the oak tree that had witnessed so much of their story, Miles felt a profound gratitude for the life he had now, and for all that had come before, even the pain, which had opened his heart to new possibilities. As the sun began to dip toward the mountains, they gathered their things and prepared to head home. Miles carefully folded the blanket while Bridget secured William in his sling. Before leaving, Miles placed his hand on the wooden cross marking Sarah's grave. "Until next Sunday," he said softly, a promise he intended to keep for as long as he was able. Together, the family made their way down the gentle slope toward home, their shadows stretching long in the late afternoon light. Behind them, the oak tree stood sentinel over its precious charge, its new leaves whispering secrets to the woman resting beneath its roots. And if, as some Inchalis whispered, the wildflowers grew especially vibrant around Sarah Tucker's grave, and if the oak tree seemed to bloom earlier each spring and hold its leaves longer each fall, well, that was just the mountain weather, wasn't it? Or perhaps it was something more, a blessing bestowed by a generous heart that had learned in death what many never grasp in life. That love, once given freely, returns tenfold in unexpected ways. Miles and Bridget Tucker would visit that grave every Sunday for the next 50 years, bringing flowers and later bringing their children and grandchildren. And every time Miles stood beneath that oak tree, he felt both the sweet ache of what he had lost and the immeasurable joy of what he had found, a circle complete, a love that transcended death, and a life richer than he could have imagined on that cold spring morning when he first dug into the earth with bleeding hands and a broken heart. In time, Miles and Bridget would be laid to rest nearby, under the same sheltering branches. But that was many years and many stories away. For now, they walked toward home, toward the future they were building together, one day at a time, while behind them, beneath the oak, Sarah kept her eternal watch, pleased that her beloved had found joy again, content that she was remembered not with bitter grief but with gratitude and wildflowers.